Today, it is our delight to be speaking with Dr. Bryan Litfin. Dr. Litfin earned a bachelor's degree in print journalism from the University of Tennessee, as well as a master's degree in historical theology from Dallas Theological Seminary. From there, he went on to the University of Virginia, taking a PhD in the field of ancient church history. He is currently professor of theology at Moody Bible Institute in downtown Chicago, where he has been teaching since 2002. Dr. Litfin teaches courses in theology, church history, and Western civilization from the ancient and medieval periods, and he is the author of a number of books on early Christianity. We have here Getting to Know the Church Fathers, an Evangelical Introduction, which Dr. Litfin published in 2007 from Brazos Press. In 2014, Dr. Litfin published Early Martyr Stories, an Evangelical Introduction with New Translations from Baker Academic Press in 2014. And Dr. Litfin is also the author of the book that we'll be discussing today, After Acts, Exploring the Lives and Legends of the Apostles. Dr. Litfin, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's my privilege, Dr. Armstrong. Thank you.
Dr. Litfin, if I can ask you as we begin, speaking as one who also has professional interest in ancient church history, I came to the field precisely motivated by the question that you address in your book, After Acts. It was this initial curiosity of an undergraduate student. What happens in church history after the book of Acts closes? Tell me, how did you come to be interested in this book that you address in your text, After Acts?
Yeah, I think a lot of us probably have had that, and I'm sure our stories are somewhat similar, and maybe evangelicals would have the story, maybe less so for a Catholic or for Orthodox, but this idea of our church being disconnected, and so having been told a history that didn't go back more than 3 or 4, 5 centuries, something like that, back to the Reformers, and then maybe also hearing about the apostles, but having this big ditch in between and not really knowing kind of what happened there. And so I can remember the first time when I was in seminary, becoming aware of these figures. Well, wait, surely somebody received the baton that the apostles in the first generation was wanting to hand off, but I had no names or no concepts for them. And I can remember making a little chart that I still have it, I think. I laminated the thing, telling you how long ago. It was a piece of paper with nation on it. And it was my attempt to try to figure out exactly what you're talking about. Who is this next generation? And so I would say that that sense of having a heritage in figures beyond the Bible, but not knowing who they were or who they are is part of what motivated me to write this book for people that might be in that same position.
Great. Dr. Litfin, of course, you know very well that our primary source of information for the stories of the apostles is the book of Acts itself. And Luke he leads the story up to chapter 28 and cuts off at a very dramatic scene. The apostle Paul is incarcerated in Rome, and we're not sure what's going to happen to this man. Tell us, in your view, why did Luke end his narrative there?
Well, it's somewhat dramatic, I would say, and then in other ways it's anticlimactic. And so it's dramatic in the sense that it's another step of building the tension, and having tried my hand at fiction, I know you have to keep turning that crank, and not that Acts is fiction, but when you're telling a story, you're cranking up the tension, and you're heightening the pathos, and you're laying in these scenes that build tension, and there's a kind of natural desire. I mean, so we have this within us, this desire to finish the story. Well, what happened? And so we have this dramatic scene, as you said, where there's been a shipwreck and drama. I mean, these are classic motifs, even in Greco-Roman literature. And he comes to his climactic place, the capital city, the biggest city, and he's in house arrest. And then Luke says, and he stayed there 2 years, the end. But there's been legal trials and the promise of a confrontation with the emperor. And, you must stand trial before the emperor. To Rome you shall go. And there are these dramatic statements that give the reader every reason to think they're going to get that story, and then they don't. So the answer to your question is, why did Luke end where he did? I think that's as much as he knew at that point. Now, many scholars will say, no, it's the natural climax. Acts is culminated with Paul in Rome. That's where he said he wanted to go. Well, actually, he didn't. What he wants to go to is the ends of the earth, beyond Rome. And so for Luke to cut it off there, someone with his artistry, someone with his literary skill, and I just mean what's demonstrated in the book of Acts, for him to cut it off there, when he would have, if he had been writing later than 62 AD, which is the time that's taking place, when he would have had the Great Fire in Rome, he would have had Paul's martyrdom, he would have had a number of narrative points, Peter's death, that he could have given us, and James as well. But he doesn't. And we know that he would want to tell a story like that because Stephen, he gives a very long martyrdom story of Stephen, who's not even as prominent as, say, like a Peter or a Paul. So the only logical conclusion one can take from that is that he's written up to the point that that's how much time had elapsed. And so therefore you would be setting the writing of Acts around 62 AD, which was the year that Paul was under house arrest in Rome.
Thank you, Dr. Litfin. I think then the question on the table becomes, if Luke finishes his narrative in 62 AD, because that's chronologically the point up to which he's experienced and lived, and you have mentioned a number of pieces of evidence that would lead us to that conclusion, then what does this relatively early dating for Acts in 62 AD or shortly thereafter mean for the other New Testament books, especially the gospel accounts?
Yeah. Well, at the beginning of Acts, he makes reference to a life of Jesus, or like basically Luke's gospel. So one would assume that had been written already. So if 62, let's say, would be the time that he's written Acts, one would have to say that not much earlier he wrote the Gospel of Luke. Now that's not to say that it has to be years and years and years ago. I mean, we sometimes have the idea that this must have been, Tolstoy, War and Peace or something, but it's not that. You could sit down in one setting and read it out. And so one could, write it out. And I'm not saying he did it in a day, but I'm not saying he needed 5 years to write Luke or Acts either. Once he had maybe his notes and his things assembled, he was ready to go, to dictate, actually. So what I'm saying is that one really can date Luke Acts as a 2-volume work into the time frame of around 61, 62 AD.
Thank you. Dr. Litfin, Luke, at the end of his book of Acts, does not tell us what happens to Paul, but we know from the book of Romans that Paul really desperately wanted to get to Spain to evangelize there, and that was, of course, known as the end of the world during Paul's day. One of the interesting features that you put in your book that I think is especially attractive to your student readership is this apostolic report card that you've put at the end of each chapter. And on Paul's report card, as it were, you've listed the tradition of went on a mission trip to Spain with a relatively solid grade of a B, indicating to the reader that you're relatively confident that Paul did make it to Spain. Now, that's very interesting. Tell us why you believe Paul did achieve his dream of going to Spain.
Well, the reason for that is not because there's very much remnant of any evidence in Spain itself. So one looks in vain for some kind of Pauline church or some kind of early tradition, or even like a grave tradition, as someone might claim that he came here and died or something. You don't have that. You don't really get the sense that he left any kind of work or ministry in Spain that was successful. So then one would think, well, then why would I give that a B? What's the deal with that? But there's two other factors, and one is that, as you mentioned, Spain represented for Paul the end of the earth, and that was more than just a kind of an expression or it was a powerful symbol for him, because he had a whole theology, and this is coming out of the Old Testament, of the light of Yahweh and of God expanding to the Gentiles, and Israel as a light to the nations and reaching the ends of the earth. And you really have to understand the way that someone like Paul, it literally was the end of the earth. Of course, they didn't know about the full globe. Of course, they didn't really know, about China or the New World, obviously, at all. So if you think about the western coast of Spain, there's nothing beyond it, and no one knows what's beyond it until Columbus. And so it's just the Atlantic Ocean. So for Paul, it he would have had the sense that his ministry had failed if he had not been the apostle. He had this sense of being the designated apostle to go to the ends of the earth. He would have had the ministry, the concept that his ministry had failed. So you have that strong impetus, which is more than just, hey, I think I'd like to go here next. It meant everything to Paul. And then basically why I think you could give this a B grade is because Spain's not that far. If you're in parts of Spain, now could he have gotten all the way around to the Atlantic coast or up there where James is supposedly buried today? Probably not. Could he have gotten to Mediterranean Spain, like Tarragona? Yes, that's probably a 3-day hop along the coast in a boat that in the Mediterranean they were going all the time. And Rome had a very in-depth trade with its province of Hispania. So parts of Spain that Paul could have set his foot in are very accessible, and we have this period of time between his end of Book of Acts and then when he died, where he easily, with the money that would have been available for some people in the Roman church, he easily could have chartered a ship, made it to Spain, stayed there a few months, didn't really get anything going, and probably came back to the Aegean. So I find that, given his desire to go there and the ease of the travel, I find it plausible.
Good. Thank you, Dr. Litfin. And I should just ask you to give us one further point. One thing that I didn't explain to the listener is, so we have Paul's strong desire to go to Spain. We have the relative ease of transportation there. But if Paul is locked away in prison, he can't follow up on those opportunities. So very briefly, why do you believe that Paul was in fact released from his first imprisonment as recorded by Luke?
Well, anybody that holds to Pauline authorship of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus needs to have something like that, because those epistles don't really fit into any chronology of his life that we see in the Book of Acts or prior to his imprisonment, his house arrest in Rome that we see in Acts. So one has to posit if Paul is the author of those, and he talks about different locations in the Aegean area that he's been to, and I overwintered here and bringing my stuff here. And so he's referencing Aegean Sea and Greece type locales that he's recently been at. One needs to find a place to accommodate those. And so conservative scholars, for that reason, suggest that he did get released on a house arrest because, as Acts itself records, the Jewish authorities didn't really show up and press their charges, and they were the ones that were pressing this, but they didn't come and press it. And so, the case kind of came to a dead end, and therefore Paul could have been released. But a few years later, we have reason to think that he was back in the capital and was martyred there. So we have a short, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 years time span that he's free for a trip to Spain, and what we know for sure is that he was back in.
We have heard the tradition that Thomas traveled as far as India. What's the likelihood of this particular historical tradition being true?
Well, I have to be careful on that because so many Christians in India make a big deal about that, including my brother-in-law, whose last name is Thomas, and that's because he's part of the historic families and tradition that Thomas came to India. So the name Thomas is big among the Christian community in India, and he's kind of their founding guy. It would be like saying, hey, George Washington, he was actually Canadian, and you don't want to say that. So that being said, with that caveat, I think it's better in the case of Thomas to think about a trajectory toward India rather than setting foot in what we would call India. And so with the Christians in India, the area that's Christianized or has the earliest roots of Christianity is in Kerala and the southern Malabar coast and down on the southern tip, and then the western part of that. And so that was the part that did have a vigorous sea trade with the Roman Empire to Alexandria and ports that were on the Red Sea that were Roman ports. So there was kind of a triangle of wind that the ships could just ride these winds, and there was a very active trade with the southern part of India. The problem with connecting Thomas to that is that, well, he would have had to have gone to Egypt to get there. And then the traditions about that are frankly not reliable because they are based on, well, there are these stone crosses that come from quite a bit later time, but most of it is based on these oral traditions kept in these Christian castes in these families of bishops within their families going back to the time of Thomas. And it's just as a historical source, it's not reliable enough to think that he got there. The more reliable tradition is that he might have gotten toward or to the Indus River Valley. The Indus River is in Pakistan, but would have been called India to the Romans. And there was another way to get there through the Silk Road, not by sea really for that one, but overland. And that would be connected to Antioch. Mm-hmm. So it would be more likely Thomas would have gone that way. But one of the spots along that, a major place along that route, was Edessa. And what we find in the earliest texts that are reliable about Thomas, at least to some degree reliable, is that he's located there and had kind of connections, and even his supposed grave was there. And by the 4th century, there was a grave in Edessa. So I think probably a trajectory toward India along the Silk Route, toward Edessa, and then Thomas getting there. But to sort of launch him all the way into Pakistan, or what we would call Pakistan, or into India, is a little bit of a stretch in terms of actual proof. So I can't give that as high of a grade. And what has the least high grade is that there's a shrine where it was St. Thomas's Mount. So today you can go on the eastern coast of India all the way around to Chennai, where there's this shrine for St. Thomas and his supposed martyrdom on top of the mountain. Well, that was brought in by the Catholics and Portuguese in the period of exploration. There's no evidence of that. So, hey, did Thomas ever go to India? No. Did he launch the church in the direction of India? That's much more likely.
Thank you for that helpful explanation. Dr. Litfin, in 2009, the Vatican announced that carbon dating tests, quote, seem to conclude that the bone fragments found inside the sarcophagus by the altar of St. Paul's outside the walls are in fact those of the historical St. Paul. In other words, the Vatican believes that we probably have found the actual bones of St. Paul. What's your view? Is it possible that the bones of St. Paul have actually been preserved until today?
Well, apart from thinking that's really cool and wanting it to be true, because of just we love Paul so much, and we like the idea that somehow we could connect to him in that way. Even Protestants who don't venerate relics probably think that's cool. We wouldn't go there to pray for a favor from the apostle, but we still would like to think that could have some reality. So I don't want to be credulous or gullible, but the bones of Paul are in a little bit of a different category than the bones of Peter, in the sense that there's a whole bunch of intrigue and ransacking and plundering that happened of the tomb of Peter, and so we could get into the issues of his bones, which the Vatican also says that they now have, but it's way more sketch. But here's the thing with Paul. The church called Outside the Walls is a beautiful church that one can visit today. You've been there, I'm sure. Yeah, and so you can sort of picture it, and it's vast and cavernous and beautifully decorated with mosaics, but almost all of that structure has been erected since 1823 when it burned down. There's an arch that one can still see there that enters into the crossing there that is old, but the rest of it has been built up. So it burned down in 1823. But what that means, and that was due to a workman repairing the roof who accidentally set a fire, tragically. But what that tells us is that church survived into basically modern times. I mean, 1823 is within certainly recent records and memories, and even getting close to the fact where you'd have artists drawing it, that we have their pictures and so forth. So so that church was there up till 1823. When did it get built, really at the end of the 4th century, in the time of Theodosius. And so that means that you have basically a kind of protected, encased tomb. It never got busted into, to my knowledge. It was surrounded and protected back to the 4th century, to the late 4th century, which in turn, that church by Theodosius, which was the one that burned down, is on top of a previous church that was there, put up in the early 4th century, much smaller. And so they made it bigger and turned it around to accommodate the pilgrims that were coming. And then that one stayed until 1823. So this takes you back until the early 4th century, where you have this continuous occupancy of this structure, the tomb, under the altar on that site. And then what did they build the smaller church on top of? A grave marker that we know from textual sources was there around 200 AD. And maybe even a few decades before that. So you really have probably within 100 years of Paul's death, you have a marker, and then it doesn't get disturbed, and then a small church gets built on it in the early 4th century, then a larger church gets built on it in the late 4th century, then that church stays there until 1823, then they build, it burns down, but nothing happens to the tomb, and so it's underground, and so then they build up the new church. And that's why in the year 2000, when everybody is coming to this church to visit it, the year of Jubilee, but they're finding that there's no access to the tomb under the altar. They're disappointed. So the Vatican authorities decide, well, let's dig in here. They find this sarcophagus, and they find this marble slab that says, to Paul, apostle and martyr. And the long story short is that there's continuous occupancy of that church from, call it 3rd century until modern times. So for that reason, to find the bone fragments of a single human male that date to the period that is appropriate is to say, pretty good chance those then are the bones of the original occupant. Who knows?
That's amazing, Dr. Litfin. And it's not the only amazing discovery that's been made in recent times concerning the apostles. In 2011, a 1st century tomb was uncovered, which archaeologists believe at one time housed the remains of Jesus' disciple Philip. What is the significance of this discovery for our understanding of the historical apostolic community?
Well, the issue with Philip is complicated by the fact that, yes, okay, so this tomb did get discovered, and it's a 1st century grave that. So it's in the city of Hierapolis, and there was a tomb that had a little chapel with it, and there was a sister church that was part of it, and there are graphic representations that have survived that the buildings haven't survived, but a little stamp that they used to press onto bread, used to make an impression on bread, and so the stamp was used to make that, and in the stamp you have a depiction of the tomb and the church with domes on it. And so this is what seems to be a 1st century tomb of Philip. The name Philip is connected with Hierapolis. But as I was going to say, the complicating issue is that the Bible has 2 Philips. And so you've got Philip, who's named in the Gospels as one of Jesus' disciples. But you have another Philip, Philip the evangelist, that shows up in the book of Acts, where he's interacting with Simon Magus, and he's Simon the magician, and he's active there evangelizing. And then later in Acts 21, I think it is, he has these daughters that prophesy. So the Philip of the evangelist of Acts is not the same as one of the disciples of Jesus. Those were 2 different Philips. But even you and I probably didn't really know that. And so the ancients confused these 2 figures, or didn't look closely and figured that they were the same. And so the issue with the tomb that's found in Hierapolis, it is a 1st century tomb, and it is connected with the man Philip from the book of Acts. It's that Philip, because it mentions that, his daughters who prophesied, they came there, I knew them. And so these texts show that the man Philip from the book of Acts, who had prophetic daughters, came and settled there, and people knew what happened to the daughters, and they remembered when she died, and this one's still alive, and so forth. So the tomb that has been discovered there is Philip, the evangelist. Philip, the book of Acts. Philip, the disciple of Jesus. Many people confused the two, assuming they were the same figure, but in reality they weren't. And so the disciple Philip, we don't know really what happened to him.
Thank you, Dr. Litfin. Dr. Litfin, is the Bible clear on what the role or the office of an apostle is? And in your view, does this office continue to this day?
Well, no, I don't think you would have an apostle today. I mean, that term gets used. I mean, the term apostle, apostello, as you know, being an expert in Greek, is a sending out. And what it originally meant was just somebody sent overseas without any kind of designation or authority. They were just sent. But what you have in Hebrew, which seems to be informing the New Testament usage of apostolos, apostle, is in Hebrew you have the shaliach, which is the divine messenger, a messenger of some kind, an appointed man who has a task, a message to give. You know, and so you're being sent, but you're not just being sent for no reason or just part of an expedition. You're actually commissioned by somebody, sent to proclaim, sent to give a message, sent to be a deputy for the one who is sending you. So that's what the shaliach is, and that seems to be informing the term apostle as it's being used by the Christians and by the New Testament. So if that's the case, then an apostle is someone that Jesus sent. People say sometimes it's someone who saw the risen Christ. Well, technically, it didn't have to be the risen Christ, because Jesus sends his disciples out on mission even before he dies and rises again. But then, of course, he does rise again, and in Matthew 28, you know, he sends his disciples out, go into all the world, baptizing. So that's why Paul is also considered an apostle, because he's Jesus does appear to him and commission him and send him out. Barnabas is also called an apostle. We don't have really a record of Barnabas receiving a vision of the risen Christ, but maybe because Jesus appeared to 500 of his followers, Barnabas could have been associated with them. I think James is called, the brother of the Lord is called an apostle. I'm not sure that reference, I forget, but those would be the few, and then there's this one reference to possibly Junia in Romans, but that's a separate topic, maybe for another day. So what is an apostle? An apostle is somebody that Jesus, the risen Christ, or during his earthly life, commissioned and said, go represent me. And that's why I don't really think you have apostles today unless somebody got a vision of the risen Christ, I suppose. But it also has the overtone of being part of that first generation who are the eyewitnesses. So I don't think I would want to go around saying that anybody today is an apostle of Jesus Christ in that sense.
Thank you, Dr. Litfin, for that. Dr. Litfin, if I can ask you one final reflection. This interview series is in a series called Unitas Fide. It's a venue that we've created for the purpose of discussing with a broad range of Christian scholars church unity and how we might be able to participate in working together for church unity. Is it possible today to envision Christian unity without the apostolic office giving the church that unity? What's your view?
Well, so obviously the Roman Catholic Church has a doctrine of apostolic succession, and other groups could use that term or a similar concept, where they're saying you don't have apostles today, but you have the designees of the apostles. You have those who received the commissioning from the apostles, and they bear the same authority that the apostles had. And so that continues in the magisterium for the Roman Catholic Church. That continues, of course, in the Bishop of Rome, through Peter, the apostle par excellence. So I doubt very much that you're going to get the Protestant evangelicals globally, for sure, to think that they're going to have an ecumenical unity with other Christian communions if it requires bowing the knee to the magisterium as the inheritors of the apostle. So your project is a good one, but I think we probably would have to build our unity around something else. And where one could perhaps find that would be not in the apostles themselves, but in the content of the kerygma, the content of the preaching of the apostles. And so what we call the Apostles' Creed, which did the apostles actually pen that creed? Well, you know that they didn't, but does that creed, as we now have it, encapsulate earlier confessions stemming all the way back to the preaching of Peter and to 1 Corinthians 15 and creedal forms in the New Testament? Yes. So the unity of the faith, as you're describing, the unitas fidei, would be something that we could build not around apostles, their inheritors today or their successors today, but those who share in common that core teaching, which we actually do. I mean, if you look at the Apostles' Creed, there's not anything really in it that would be agreed to by evangelicals and denied by Catholics, or vice versa. We would all hold to that content. So that shows you that we have a lot of core commonality, even with something like Rome. Not to say with Lutherans or Methodists, groups like that. But there would be other things dividing us. I mean, having apostolic doctrine in place, we might still find other reasons to be divided. But in answer to your question, I would say we should focus around unity with Christians that hold a common core faith, a kind of mere Christianity, and agree to disagree on the other things.
It's been our delight to be speaking with Dr. Bryan Litfin today. Dr. Litfin is professor of theology at Moody Bible Institute in Chicago and also author of the book that we've been discussing, After Acts, Exploring the Lives and Legends of the Apostles. Dr. Litfin, thank you so much for being with us today.
Well, truly, it's my honor, Dr. Armstrong. Thank you for your tech savvy and global perspective, and just for the ministry of Unitas Fidei, and may that ministry go forward and be a blessing to the church.